Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Don't be surprised by the sound of my voice, I've mentioned the reason for it in my previous videos. If you want to know more, feel free to check out those earlier uploads. Today, we'll be sharpening my Civivi Elementum with a button lock. The blade is made of 14C 28N steel. This knife is one of my oldest and remains one of my favorites. I originally bought it because of its appealing design, but it also offers excellent value for money. Another reason was the type of steel. It's fantastic for sharpening and polishing, making it ideal for testing out new sharpening techniques. Thanks to the hollow grind, the edge stays relatively thin even after frequent sharpening, which makes wear less noticeable. Currently, the blade has a sharpening angle of 15 degrees, but I've tested many angles ranging from 13 to 19 degrees to find the optimal sharpness. For sharpening, we'll be using my Veniv MS1 sharpening stones today. To finish, the blade will be polished to a mirror finish using my resin-bonded diamond stones, starting with a 3/2 micron, followed by 2/1 micron. Stick around, and I'll show you step by step how I go about it. Afterward, we'll only strop on leather with 0.1 micron grit. But first, I'll use my polishing blocks, starting with 1 micron and working my way down to 0.1 micron. All the polishing blocks are coated with diamond emulsion from the same brand to ensure a consistent progression during edge refinement. After that, we'll return to the 0.1 micron leather strop since the diamonds in leather sit deeper than those in wood, producing an even finer finish. In our last sharpening video, we tested the PDT Tools sharpening stone with 1/0 micron grit for the first time. If you haven't seen that video yet, feel free to check it out. I also made an unboxing video for it. However, the sharpening results did not meet my expectations. Previously, I tested the PDT Tools 5/4 micron grit, and I was very satisfied with it. Even though these stones have a metallic bond, I found under the microscope that the 5/3 grit produces a slight mirror finish. So, I assumed the 1/0 grit would be an improvement over the 2/1 resin-bonded stones from Veniv. Surprisingly, the 1/0 grit left a coarser finish than the 5/3 grit stone. I'm currently in contact with the retailer, and PDT is investigating whether this issue is due to the sharpening stone itself, a production defect, or the metallic bond. For this reason, we'll leave that stone in the drawer today and won't use it. Before sharpening, we'll test the knife with the BESS tester. During sharpening, I'll show you microscope footage of the edge. At the end, we'll check the final result with the BESS tester. First, we'll set up the test medium. I use a 100-gram weight and a simple magnetic clamp to ensure consistent, comparable results every time. The tension on the thread can make a big difference in the results, so it's best to press down as slowly as possible while watching the numbers as they rise. "195 grams, that's equivalent to a new kitchen knife or even about 50 BESS below that. Visually, the blade shows no chips or deep scratches that I can detect. We could start with a finer sharpening stone, but I always go through all the grits to ensure the results are comparable. So, let's set everything up, bring you in closer, and get started with sharpening. Since today we'll clamp the knife in the middle, we'll use the L adapters. These allow the standard clamps to come closer together, centering the knife better on the rotation axis. Without the L adapters, the clamps can only get this close to each other, which looks like this. With the L adapters, we can achieve better centering, similar to the single clamp from TSPROF. The assembly is relatively simple. I always place the adapters with the clamp on a flat table. we'll need a 2.5mm hex key. Then, I screw in the screws until they are slightly tight, and then tighten them a bit more, but don't over-tighten them. The first clamp is ready. When positioning, it's important to make sure that the clamps or the L adapters are aligned so that the clamping screw is on top for both clamps. If you accidentally install them upside down, it will be difficult to work with later, so it's best to double-check beforehand. In the end, we can use the standard screws to attach them to the Kadet Pro as usual. This way, we can clamp the knife in the center and keep it aligned with the rotation axis. Another advantage of the L adapters is that they can also be installed in such a way that even longer knives can be clamped securely. What I like to use are small, thin 0.5mm silicone pads. These compensate for slight irregularities in the blade and ensure that the knife can be clamped more securely. I always use them on one side here since I primarily rely on one clamp to fix the knife. The second clamp is only there to support the blade. This way, the knife doesn't get clamped at an angle because the second clamp closes tighter, keeping the blade centered. To make attaching the silicone pads easier, I apply a bit of sharpening oil to them. This makes the pad stick in place, making them much easier to position. Next, we grab our tools, align the knife, and tighten the screws. We do the same with the second clamp. Then we check if anything moves, adjust slightly if necessary, and everything will be perfectly in place. It's best to also check the backside to make sure everything is aligned. Once more, we clean everything thoroughly. It's important to clean the blade and edge properly before sharpening to ensure no glue or other residues get onto the sharpening stones. Next, we trim any excess edges from the silicone pads. We do the same on the other side. To protect the handle during sharpening, I use self-adhesive bandage material. This keeps the handle clean, even if your hands get oily during sharpening. Before using the first sharpening stone, I mark the edge with a red marker to clearly see where the stone is making contact. I used to always use a black marker, but the red marker provides greater contrast against the steel, making it easier to identify small details. That's it for the preparation. Now we can start sharpening. Since the knife doesn't have any significant damage to its edge, we could technically start with a finer sharpening stone since the sharpening angle is already known. This could save material on the blade and extend the knife's lifespan. However, I really enjoy sharpening, and by always starting from the same point, it's easier to compare new methods or materials. That's why I always start with the coarsest stone, regardless of the condition of the edge. In this case, it's the 200/160 VIN of MS1 edition. Before clamping the first sharpening stone, we need to use the thickness compensator. This is very simple. Pull the compensator upward, position the stone, tighten it, and now the sharpening angle will remain exactly the same, even with stones of varying thickness. I mostly use the Axe Cube one to set the angle. However, you can also use a combination of both tools or just the thickness compensator. I always position the sharpening stone at a spot where I can measure it exactly later to avoid any inaccuracies. This means I align it at the heel of the blade because it's difficult to consistently find the exact center point if measuring in the middle. To set the angle, I place the Axe Cube 1 on the sharpening stone holder, zero it out once, and then place it in the designated holder at the back. This makes setting the angle very easy. I'll zero the Axe Cube again here, as I'll be using the thickness compensator later, but also checking my accuracy with the Axe Cube. Now I make 2 passes to see where I'm removing material. That looks good, so we can begin sharpening the knife. As you can see in the rear area, I'm hitting the previously set angle very well. However, in the front area, there is often an issue, If the knife is clamped unevenly or the distance from the rotational axis varies, the angle may shift slightly depending on the knife's rotation. Everyone has their own technique for sharpening movements. I always observe the sharpening pattern on the edge and use the reflection to see what the sharpening stone is doing to the edge. At the tip, it's important to ensure you don't run the center of the stone over the tip. Otherwise, the stone could tilt over the tip and round it off. What I always do is place my index finger on the tip of the knife. As soon as I feel the sharpening stone reach that point, I know to stop and can prevent rounding off the tip. Another crucial point is to avoid spending too much time on a single area, especially when working on the tip. Instead, regularly move the sharpening stone along the entire edge. This keeps the edge straight and prevents waves. On polished knives, even small unevenness on the edge becomes very visible at the end. The curved sections of a knife often require more attention because the contact surface with the sharpening stone is smaller there. In flat sections, the entire sharpening stone is in contact, whereas further along the belly of the knife, the contact point is relatively small. I regularly check to see if I can already feel the burr. The more precise your work with the first stone, the less effort the next stones will require. The first stone sets the foundation for how sharp the knife will ultimately become, as it establishes the edge geometry, while the following stones only refine it. I can now feel the burr along the entire edge. Before switching to the other side, I make a few even passes from back to front to smooth out any unevenness caused by inconsistent movements. This is especially helpful if you aim for mirror polish at the end. Next, I apply 1 or 2 drops of sharpening oil to the stone and begin with the other side. After switching sides, I start with light passes from back to front to gently break the burr. Here too, I can see that I'm hitting the edge perfectly. It's important not to switch to the next stone immediately after feeling the burr on the second side. You should always aim to spend equal time on both sides to remove material evenly. Only then will you end up with a symmetrical and consistent edge. There are several ways to ensure this. You can either time your work or count the number of passes you make per side. But as you sharpen more knives, you'll develop a good sense of how much time you need per side. Additionally, always observe the edge to monitor how the sharpening pattern develops. This helps you decide when to switch sides. I can now feel the burr from the back to the tip and have spent approximately the same time on each side. It's also essential to clean the blade before moving on to the next sharpening stone to ensure that no residue from the previous stone remains on the edge. Before I change the sharpening stone, I usually apply a few drops of sharpening oil and spread it thoroughly. This helps to lift the sharpening residue from the stone's surface. As you can see, all the sharpening dust collects on the tissue. Now we switch to the next stone, the 160/125 grit. Since all the stones are the same thickness, I don't need to adjust the thickness compensator or the angle, so I can continue directly. As always, I add a few drops of sharpening oil, and off we go. The decision of when to switch to the next sharpening stone and how much time to spend on each one depends largely on the result you want to achieve. For a sharp knife, you can switch relatively quickly. However, if you're aiming for mirror polish, you'll need to sharpen until the new stone fully replaces the scratch pattern of the previous one. Over time, you'll be able to recognize this visually as you get to know your sharpening stones better. If you're unsure, here's a tip: regularly color the edge with a marker. By observing where the marker remains, you can identify areas that haven't been fully worked on yet. This is especially important for achieving a mirror polish. You need to completely remove the coarse scratches left by the first stone. The more precise you are, the better the final polish will look. For microscope shots, I plan to use a microscope attached to the camera I use for filming. In future videos, you won't see me inspecting the edge under the microscope, as I can't film and use the microscope simultaneously. Feel free to let me know in the comments if the filming angle I'm using works for you or if you'd prefer closer shots of the knife. I'm currently experimenting with different setups to improve the videos for you. I plan to make my future videos more varied, alternating between sharpening sessions and videos discussing interesting topics related to sharpening. This will include introducing new materials, like diamond emulsions, and showcasing my complete sharpening setup in detail. I'll also cover technical topics and debunk myths, such as the idea that certain knife steels shouldn't be sharpened beyond a specific grit level. There's a belief that edges finished at 600 or 1200 grit perform better, or that the so-called toothy edge is superior. What is a toothy edge? It's when you finish sharpening with a coarser stone. Initially, the effect is impressive because the knife feels extremely sharp. However, under a microscope, you'll see that this sharpness comes from coarse burrs resembling small teeth. The issue is that this burr, which makes the knife seem so sharp at first, breaks off very quickly. Once that happens, the knife loses its sharpness. Therefore, the general rule is, regardless of the steel, you can always sharpen and polish a knife to the finest possible grit. If you work precisely, especially when removing the burr, you'll achieve a sharper edge that stays sharp for much longer. It all comes down to proper technique and attention to detail. Now we've reached the final stone in the MS1 series. This stone typically leaves a very nice, almost polished edge. For most people, this would be more than sufficient. Particularly with this steel, which takes a polish quickly and effectively, the result is already convincing. But, of course, we want to get the best possible outcome, especially achieving a low BESS score. One thing I particularly like about the MS1 stones is that, even with finer grits, the material removal is excellent, allowing for fast progress. So, let's move on to the next stone. As you know, sharpening stones of different thicknesses usually pose a challenge when it comes to maintaining the exact angle during a switch. With the TSPROF Kadet, the thickness compensator solves this issue. Since we set the angle based on the first stone's thickness, the compensator ensures that we maintain the same angle even when switching to a stone of different thickness. I always double-check this. I adjust the thickness compensator and then verify the angle with the axe cube to ensure everything is perfectly aligned. In this case, it's spot on at 15.4 degrees, exactly as it should be. For additional confirmation, I mark the edge with a red marker to ensure I'm hitting the edge perfectly. Once the marker is completely removed, I know the angle is correct. As you can see, the edge is perfectly aligned. The red marker is completely gone, and the angle is spot on. The 5/4 micron stone already produces a very good polish. I sharpen each side for 2 minutes using my usual technique and finish the last 30 seconds with even strokes. We won't aim for a perfect mirror polish today, but we can definitely do that in a future video if you're interested. For a mirror polish, I typically spend at least 5 minutes per side on the last 2 polishing stones and finish with leather strops coated down to 0.1 microns. That concludes the first set. Now I'll grab my 2 polishing stones, and we'll continue. Now we move on to my polishing stone. Once again, the thickness varies slightly, so I'll use the thickness compensator. I double-check the angle using the X-cube and mark 2 to 3 spots on the cutting edge with my marker. Everything is perfectly set, so we're ready to begin. You can see that the 3 small marks we had earlier are now completely gone. I set the timer for 3 minutes per side and start polishing. The more time you spend with the polishing stones, the better the result will be. As I continue polishing, the mirror finish becomes increasingly visible. With the final polishing stone, I work very carefully. The result looks good. The only flaw is that I can still see a few deeper scratches that we didn't completely polish out, but overall, I'm happy with the outcome. Now it's time to minimize the burr. To begin, I make 2 to 3 very light passes. Then, I alternate sides and repeat the process until I can no longer feel or see the burr. I recommend switching sides at least 15 times. Take your time with this step to thoroughly break and remove the burr with the polishing stone. I think many people sharpen well, but don't spend enough time properly removing the burr at the end. The burr, including the burr root, is fully removed when we start working with felt. For more details, you can check out my video where I explain why I specifically use felt for deburring. Important, never use the technique I'm about to show with leather or wooden strops. Doing so would only reduce the sharpness of your knife. This technique works exclusively with specially hardened felt, and in my experience, it's most effective when combined with an alcohol-based diamond emulsion. That should cover everything for now. Before we move on to my wooden strops, we'll properly deburr the knife using felt. It's important to clean the knife thoroughly beforehand. Now I'll put away the sharpening stones, grab my strops and the felt, and we'll continue shortly. Let's start with the felt. I've already uploaded a video showing how to assemble and coat the felt. For this knife steel, it's recommended to strop at a slightly higher angle of 1.6 degrees. Since we sharpened the knife at 15.4 degrees, we'll now set the angle to exactly 17 degrees. Important, do not use this technique with leather, strops, or sharpening stones unless you want to create a secondary bevel at the cutting edge. In that case, you could use the sharpening stone. However, for deburring and properly removing the burr root, this technique only works with felt and no other material. We're working with an angle of exactly 17 degrees. The technique is the same as when working with leather, always stropping toward the cutting edge. This also removes the burr root. Here, too, we work completely without pressure and let the materials do the work. That's it for the felt. I think you can clearly see the residue our burr, including the burr root, is now on the felt. What I always do next is clean the knife with alcohol, even if I'm working with the same grit. Since I apply different emulsions on the strops, I clean the knife to prevent contamination. Now let's move on to the wooden strops. All the strops are coated with stroppy stuff. Wood has the advantage of not compressing, unlike leather. This means we won't round off the cutting edge if we maintain the same angle we used during sharpening. What we need to do now is set the angle precisely. We'll go back to the sharpening angle we used earlier, 15.4 degrees. When we begin stropping and polishing, a very fine microburr forms. We can remove this later with a good hanging strop. The purpose of stropping with wood is not to achieve a perfect mirror polish, but to refine the very tip of the cutting edge for a better overall result. That's it for the wooden strops. We finish at 0.1 microns. The final step is a few passes with leather. Since the diamonds are embedded deeper in the leather structure than in the wood, you get a finer finish with the same grit on leather compared to wood. That's why I use leather one last time with the same grit as the final wooden strop. Once again, we need to adjust the angle. When working with leather, you usually reduce the angle by 0.1 to 0.3 degrees, as leather is soft and would otherwise wrap over the cutting edge. However, the leather I'm using is relatively hard. Through testing, I've found that the best results come from maintaining the exact same angle as during sharpening. Here, too, I work without pressure and make only a few passes per side. That's it for the leather. I think the result turned out quite well. However, I should have spent more time on the coarser sharpening stones, especially near the tip. I can still see a few isolated scratches, but the knife already feels very sharp. Now I'll unclamp the knife, tidy everything up, and finish with the hanging strop. Then we'll take a look at the final result together. Finally, I'll show you some close-ups and a paper cutting test. So, now I've unclamped the knife. The result already feels quite sharp. First, we'll perform a BESS test without using the hanging strop, and then we'll use the strop to compare the results before and after treatment. Let's see what result we get. .130, that's a good result for this knife. However, the result also shows that there's still a very fine burr remaining from stropping. For a sharpening angle of 15 degrees, the knife should fall somewhere between 70 and 90 BESS. I'll show you the corresponding list. Now, we'll use the hanging strop and see if we can further improve the result. To start, I'll use my old hanging strop and work with the rough side first. I'll maintain the same angle as during sharpening and slowly strop the knife 10 times per side. After that, I'll move to my large hanging strop and use the smooth side with the same technique again, 10 passes per side. That's it for the strops. The knife already feels sharper. Now let's go back to the BESS tester and see what's changed. The result is 95, that's okay. We improved by 35 BESS. Of course, I would have preferred a result around 70 BESS. The last result we achieved with the Spyderco Manix 2 was 65 BESS. Naturally, any BESS value below 100 at a 15-degree angle is good. Ideally, you should perform 3 measurements, but the test medium isn't cheap, so I usually only do 1. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you'd like to see 3 measurements per knife. Now we'll do a cutting test with the knife using very thin brochure paper. That's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully, you also learned something new. If you have any questions or suggestions for things you'd like me to show, feel free to share them in the comments. Remember, keep your knives sharp.